Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. Today we're going to talk about bank financing. All right, here we go. Okay, so bank financing is really important to any organization or operation because it really allows us to run our cash flow and finances smoother. Right? So when we have the right level, a good level of bank finances, everyone's happy. And when we don't have a good level of bank financing, sometimes we're stressed, right? And that not good level could be maybe it's insufficient bank financing, or maybe we have too many loans from previous projects with aggressive repayments, and it makes our cash flow really stressful. So let's talk about all the different aspects of bank financing, and hopefully we can all learn and make better use of the information here. So bank financing use is designed to assist us with cash flow for operations, projects, and investments. Bank financing should not be viewed as funding. We all know it, but many times our leaders, many times economic development people approach a project and they're like, oh yeah, let's just get a bank loan, right? Money's coming in. Well, for us in finance, we know that bank financing has to be repaid, right? It's not funding. There is cost to it. There is interest that we have to pay. There is bank fees, and then there are repayments that are going to be affecting our cash flow. If they're too aggressive, then our cash flow is going to be stressful to manage. So in general, the best use for bank financing is for funded programs or for projects with sufficient profits to repay the loans, right? So good examples would be our line of credit that's used for just day-to-day operating financing. Is just designed to cover the time gap between when we receive funding and when we have to pay expenses, right? So sometimes if funding is delayed and we have significant expenses, we can rely on that line of credit. But ultimately, the funding is coming in to repay that line of credit, so we never have to worry about repaying it. If it's a good amount, a good limit, and it's sufficient for our operations. It revolves, right? Funding coming in, it's repaid, and then we use it again when we need to. So when we invest in bigger projects, say we buy an investment in business or maybe some big construction project, this is when it becomes trickier. Nobody buys an investment or goes into a project thinking it's going to be losing money, right? Most of us see those projected business plans and financial projections, and they show big profits, and obviously they show there is sufficient money to repay the loans, right? But if it were always that good, then all our First Nations would be doing really, really well financially, right? And maybe some of us do well, but I'm sure we all had experience with projects that look good on paper, but then once we went into it, they weren't so good as far as profits and cash flow coming from them. So it's important to remember bank loans are a burden on our organization in the end, unless we have money coming in to repay. Any project we're looking to invest in, we have to be very confident that the project can pay back the loans. And if it's a project that's not designed to pay back the loans, for instance, housing, right? Many First Nations like to invest in constructing housing because it's, one of the bigger issues for First Nations is lack of housing. So sometimes we will borrow money for housing construction, and unless we charge in rent, unless there is maybe it's housing for income assistance clients, and we get in CMHC shelter allowance, CMHC rent. There isn't really a way to repay the loans from investment in those housing, right? So in that case, the First Nation needs to be really solid on where the repayment is coming from. Is it coming from own source revenue? Is it coming from some funding? We really need to think about the repayment of those loans. You'll see a little picture that I put in here. It's nice to get loans, but they can be a burden, right? Okay, so let's talk about the types of bank financing. Short-term financing for operations and cash flow, that's our line of credit. You'll see I refer to it as LOC, just for abbreviation, later in the presentation. We can have another type of short-term financing, and short-term, that's normally, something that gets repaid within a year, within a couple of months or so. So another type of short-term financing is interim financing for projects. Sometimes we have a big project, the funding is supposed to come, we want to start it earlier than the funding comes, so we go to the bank and we get an interim loan. So it's a short-term loan, it will be repaid as soon as funding is received. For long-term financing, which over a year long, right? And it can go as long as 25 or 30 years. So we use it for equipment purchases and investments. Normally, those loans are called term loans because they have a term, right? They last normally for as long as our project lasts. So whether it's 5 years for equipment purchase or maybe 25 years for some investment, those are longer term loans. Then we have long-term financing for housing and potentially other buildings. Those are mortgages. Right? The difference between a term loan and a mortgage is the mortgage is secured by the actual buildings. That's a classic mortgage. And when it's secured by the actual building, the bank has less risk. So they're able to extend the term of the loan longer. Mortgages are normally for 25 years, right? And they're also able to offer lower interest rates on the mortgages. And then another type of financing available only to First Nations is FNFA, the First Nations Financing Authority. And that one is very interesting. We hear about the stock markets, right? People that invest in stocks and bonds. The whole idea of a stock market is for companies, for big public companies, to access money, to access cash flow. And how do they do it? They issue bonds, which is their debt obligation, basically, right? And they get money from the public. So if I buy a bond, that means that company owes me money, that the corporation owes me money, and they pay me interest on that bond, which becomes my investment income. And then at any time, I can get that bond sold and get that loan repaid, right? So really what FNFA did, it's quite neat because they use the same mechanism. So it's FNFA as a group for all First Nations that are members goes to the stock market and they issue bonds. So they borrow from the public, they borrow from the stock market, right? And so First Nations through FNFA are able to access the stock market and borrow from it, just like large corporations. Now, what's the benefit here? Well, the benefit is FNFA are able to get way lower interest rates, way lower cost of borrowing than conventional banks can get. So this is something to definitely look into if your First Nation is looking for financing options. Let's talk about the elements of bank financing. So loan purpose and risk. Well, what are we taking the loan for and how risky is the project? That is going to determine all the terms, right? Because if the project is risky, the bank is going to want to charge a higher interest rate and they're going to want more security. They're going to say, okay, what happens if you can't repay the loan? What can we have as security, right? If the project is less risky, just like a mortgage, then they're more relaxed because they get security through those buildings and they're able to give us lower interest rate and longer term for the loan. So then we have loan term and duration. And ideally, we want it aligned with the project's purpose and duration, right? So if I'm buying equipment that's going to last me 5 years, maybe the loan term should be 5 years. If I'm buying a house or building a house that's hopefully lasts 25, 30 years, then I can take a mortgage for that term, right? If I'm investing into a business, then it becomes a function of what my cash flows from the business are. Like, when is it realistic to finish repaying that loan? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Right? You rarely see a bank giving a loan for 20 years for a business purchase, but everything can be done if they really try. So one other distinction I want to make here is from bankers' perspective. When they talk about term, those are shorter periods of time within the loan. So if I have a mortgage for 25 years, the duration of the mortgage, the full term is 25 years, but then it also has shorter terms, normally of 5 years each. And this is when interest rate resets, right? So we get a mortgage for what's called a fixed interest rate and change in rate. The bank doesn't want to say, okay, it's not going to change for the next 25 years. That's too much risk for them, right? Because interest rates change, the markets change. So they say, okay, your term is 5 years, meaning we don't have to repay the loan in 5 years, but we do have that option. But in 5 years, my interest rate resets to whatever is on the market, okay? And definitely in those 5 years term, I can renegotiate the loan terms and refinance with a different bank if I find a better deal. So just that distinguishing the banking terms. When we say term, there is the full term of the loan, and there is the terms of when it's time to renegotiate and when the interest rate resets. Then we have repayment timing and amount, and that should be comfortable with our cash flow, pretty straightforward. Security or collateral, legal word here. So those are the assets that they use to secure the loan. So normally in conventional mortgages, it's the houses, it's the buildings that they use to secure the loan. Another common thing, bank puts in a security, what's called a general security agreement. So they're basically saying everything you own is used to secure the loan. Now that can sound scary, but really because it's so general, it's not as strong as specific security. So if they say, well, you invested in this business, so now now this business itself is specific security for the loan, that's a stronger security for the bank as opposed to just saying general security agreement. It's hard for them to go after general security agreements. So when we see that, it's just normal, it's standard, and it's not as strong as specific assets. Okay. So now interest rate, this is our cost of borrowing. Interest rates are based on Bank of Canada prime rate. Prime rate is just a name for interest rate that Bank of Canada lends to commercial banks at. So to give us a loan, a commercial bank has to go and borrow money from the Bank of Canada, and this is where their borrowing rate is gonna depend on the prime rate, okay? Now the prime rate is a part of the government's economic policy. So, whenever there is talks about inflation, right now there is a lot of talks about inflation, how prices are rising. The government's tool to control inflation is actually the interest rate. Because if they increase interest rate, it becomes more expensive to borrow and people are going to buy less, right? Like, look what's happening, for instance, to the housing market. Interest rates are up, so people can't get mortgages as easily. Mortgage payments are higher. So all of a sudden, there is less activity on the housing market, not as it was even a year ago, right? During COVID, when it was pretty crazy with the low interest rates. right? So what's happening right now is a good example. There is a scare of inflation. The government thinks, oh, the prices are rising, right? Maybe inflation. And so they raised the interest rate. That prime interest rate used to be 1%. It used to be very low during COVID, right? And right now it is at 6.7%, so very high. So if we're looking to get a loan right now, well, it's not such a good time. The cost of borrowing is going to be higher, okay? Another element in bank financing is the fees that the bank gets, and they don't forget about themselves ever. So normally they get a fee upon approving the loan, and it can be significant. It can be like $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, depends on how much is involved, how much financing we're getting. And then there is also annual loan review fees, which can be, you know, reasonable, $250, or maybe unreasonable, more like 1,000, depending on the bank. So let's talk about the individual elements here of financing, or I guess different loans. So the line of credit, that is our operating financing. It's used to finance the gap between paying operational expenses and receiving funding. Line of credit limit, normally it has a limit, right? The bank says, well, you can borrow from line of credit up to 300,000 or maybe up to $1 million. So the rule of thumb here that our line of credit limit should be sufficient to cover at least 2 payrolls. So we should be able to operate for a month with just our line of credit, right? So if my payrolls and expenses for 1 month, I say $500,000, then my line of credit should be at least $500,000, okay? Most banks, when working with First Nations, would determine your line of credit limit by using monthly average ISC funding. So if I get 24 million a year from ISC for my First Nation, and my monthly average funding is 2 million based on that, the bank may give me a line of credit of up to $2 million. If you are in that situation, say you get $2 million on average from ISC, but your line of credit is something ridiculous, like $100,000, well, maybe it's time to look into your financing options, okay? Because the line of credit, it doesn't cost you much to have it if you don't use it, but it's good to have for security, right? We've been very lucky with the Liberal government in charge and funds and flow into First Nations, but for the ones of you that were around when the Conservatives were in charge and we barely had any money coming, this is when line of credit comes handy. You really need to cover that gap between funding and expenses and projects. So for a line of credit, we don't have set repayment terms. It's a revolving loan, right? When funding comes in, it's supposed to repay it fully. It's a zero, and then new month starts. We start making payroll expenses, and we go into the line of credit. No set repayment terms. Interest rate for line of credit is normally a variable interest rate. So for short-term financing, anything under a year, we normally don't get a fixed rate, right? It's a very short term, so we go with variable, and that's what the banks offer. Variable means is dependent on the prime rate from the Bank of Canada, right? So the interest rate would be prime rate plus a certain percentage. If the bank considers us very low risk, we can get just the prime rate. It's not very common. You normally get at least prime and 0.5%, but it could go up to prime plus 2%, depending on their perception of how risky our business is. Security for a line of credit is normally a general security agreement. So normally no specific assets used to secure the loan or as a collateral. Okay? And remember the general security agreement, very general, very standard, every bank uses it. It's not really that strong, okay? Line of credit should not be used to finance losses or long-term projects. Line of credit should revolve, right? So we're in a situation where our line of credit doesn't revolve, meaning there's always a balance there. So I have a $300,000 line of credit and I'm always sitting at 200,000 balancing. And then another 100 is available to me for operations. But is it enough? Is it covering my 2 payrolls? Is it covering my 1 month's operation? Maybe, maybe not. In general, line of credit isn't supposed to sit there and not revolve. And why is that? It's because there are no set repayment terms. If it just sits there, we never have an opportunity to repay it, right? So if we know that in our line of credit, there is a portion that doesn't revolve, that we're always in there for, in my example, 200,000 out of the 300 total, then it's time to talk to the bank about getting a term loan and terming out that portion of the line of credit that's not getting repaid every month or so. And this is because we just want to repay it. Otherwise, it sits in there and it's not allowing us to use it for operations like it's intended to. So we term out the 200,000 that's always there in my example. Now all of a sudden we're freeing that up. We're freeing up the full 300,000 in a line of credit to use for operations, and that 200,000 is getting slowly repaid by monthly payments in a term loan. Okay, let's talk about term loans. So this is our long-term or longer-term financing. We use them to finance long-term projects such as equipment purchases, business investments, different economic development projects. Term loans normally require equity contribution of around 20 to 30%, meaning the maximum loan amount would be 70 to 80% of the project cost. So when we go into investing in a project, we really should consider, do we have the equity component? Now, many times we can get funding for the equity component, right, from the government and then get the loan for the rest of the project. That is definitely a consideration. Term loans rarely cover the full amount that we need for the project. Now, repayment terms are based on the project's nature. It can be 3 years for, say, some equipment purchase, and can be up to 20 years for business purchase and maybe some construction projects. So it really depends on the project's duration, on the cash flow, on the expected profits, right? So it should be driven by that. And we also remember that cash flow is important. So loan repayments should be comfortable for our cash flow. So if we get a loan for a project, we think it's going to be very, very profitable, but we have aggressive loan repayments. And what happens is that project struggles for cash flow while we're repaying the loans. And we never want that cash flow struggle. So interest rates for term loans can be either fixed, meaning unchanging, or variable, meaning linked to the prime rate. And normally the interest rate is somewhere between prime to prime plus 3%. If you have more than prime plus 3%, that's already aggressive borrowing, right? Because with prime being at 6.7, almost 7%, prime plus 3 is almost 10% of the borrowing cost nowadays. So that's becoming pretty aggressive. Security for term loans is normally a general security agreement, because remember, the banks like using that. And then they also use specific assets and revenues related to the project. So if I'm buying equipment using a term loan, then that equipment is going to be a specific security for the loan. If anything happens and I can't repay the loan, the first thing the bank is going to go after is to seize that equipment if they can, right? Now, that's never their preferred strategy, because they're not in business of seizing and selling equipment, but it's definitely a stronger security for a loan when it is a specific asset. Loan duration and monthly repayments should be comfortable for our cash flow. I keep repeating that because I think it's so important. one of my First Nations, when I started working with them, had a loan. They refinanced the loan. They had a loan with comfortable payments for about $30,000 a month, and then they got approached by a different bank and decided to refinance with them, and loan repayments became $90,000 a month because the new bank gave it loan for a shorter term, and that was literally undoable. Like, they couldn't make the payments. We had to go refinance it for a second time with somebody else to make it more doable. So it really needs to be watched. It's important to consider where loan repayment will come from, right? Again, if we're counting on the business to be profitable enough to pay for those loans, well, we better be pretty confident about that, because the alternative is the First Nations cash flow starts suffering because the loan needs to be repaid, whether the business we bought can afford it or not, right? Mortgages. So those are the longest term loans. They're used to finance housing, buildings, and construction projects. So in general, conventional mortgage is where a bank takes the buildings and the housing as security, right? Now, we all know that what happens on First Nations land, the bank has no access to housing and assets on First Nation lands, right? So the bank doesn't get the same type of security when it's on treaty land, the project, right? So to give the bank security and reduce the risk, what the government does is gives them a guarantee, right? So we have CMHC insurance for some of CMHC housing, or I should say all CMHC housing. And then we have a ministerial loan guarantee that's provided by ISC. Again, this is used to replace conventional mortgage where the bank gets the building as security, because the bank can't use assets on First Nations land, houses and buildings, as security for the loan. Because the banks get that ministerial loan guarantee and CMHC insurance, they're able to provide the same terms as to anyone else. That's enough security for them. Repayment terms for mortgages are around 25 years. In Canada, they stopped giving mortgages for longer than 25 years. And in general, if it's a CMHC project, we don't want it to be longer than 25 years because we get mortgage subsidies from CMHC, and those only last for 25 years, right? Interest rates on mortgages are the lowest because the bank's risk is lowest. There is specific asset to secure, or CMHC insurance and ministerial loan guarantee. Interest rates can be fixed or variable. And now remember, even if they're fixed, it's only fixed for a term, right? It can be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So watch that. And because interest rates are the lowest, they're normally below the prime rate on the mortgages. Buildings not on reserve land, the bank will use the building as security for the mortgage, like we said. CMHC tend to have the best mortgage rates for housing. So if you are to buy housing, definitely check what to do housing construction, you have a housing project, definitely check CMHC for mortgage rates. In my experience, they're normally lower than anything banks offer. Repayment. So remember how we want to consider repayment, and for housing, that's a tricky one. So unless this is a CMHC project, which is limited by the allocations they give to our First Nations every year, it's never enough, right? Because all our First Nations really need housing. So if we do have a CMHC project, then repayment comes from mortgage subsidies. CMHC give us for 25 years. And it also comes from potentially shelter allowance, which is rent that's paid to us for income assistance clients. So if you have a CMHC project, it's definitely most beneficial to put income assistance tenants in those houses, because you get some mortgage subsidies, and then you also get shelter allowance. CMHC pays or government pays the rent for CMHC houses. Okay, so now if we're not in the CMHC project, what's coming from housing? Potentially rent, if we charge rent from our members. I don't know many First Nations that do, but some do, right? And if we don't charge rent, then we definitely have to come up with alternative sources to repay, which normally is own source revenue. It's definitely something to consider and be very solid about. Where is the repayment coming from? Let's talk about how to manage the existing financing we have. So first thing we want to do is to understand the current structure. We want to review the current loans, the bank agreement, and kind of say, okay, what do we have? Another good source could be a long-term debt note, so that loans note in the last annual audit, because it nicely summarizes all the loans that we have and their terms. Okay, so if you're not aware of what your financing structure is, or you're not fully aware, two things I would look at is the annual audit, the long-term debt loan, note in the main audit, and obviously the bank agreements. Notice the reporting requirements in the bank agreements. The banks want your annual audit. They sometimes may want interim financial statements, so internal statements, and sometimes for businesses, they do want financial ratios, right? So certain calculations from the financial statements. It's not very common for First Nations. It's only if we own a business, they may kind of get into the financial ratios. So if we're late with reporting, bank will charge fees just because they can, right? But more than that, some of them are very strict, and if we're late with reporting, they can demand loan repayment. So they can say you have 30 days to repay that loan because your reporting is so late. It actually happened to one of my clients. They're residential school survivors, nonprofit, and their audit was late by 2 years. So one of the major banks just gave them a letter saying, okay, we've been asking for your audit for a very long time. You haven't provided it. You have 30 days to repay our loan. Okay, so it's possible, it does happen. So like with everything, it is important to establish a relationship with your contact at the bank, right? Because the banker, they do have some power. If you late with reporting, they can explain it to the bank, they can speak up for you, they can delay those reporting requirements. Sometimes if you can't make loan payments, if you have a very difficult cash flow month, they'll actually allow you to defer it, right? And they can also assist with new financing. If they need more money, then definitely good to have a relationship to approach the banker about new funding, new loans. So if we are in a happy relationship with our bank, well, that's great. If we review the bank financing and we think, okay, this is good, this is working for me, working for the First Nation, right? That's great. Sometimes the banker can be a valuable business partner to our organization, right? If our relationship is not happy, or the kind of like isn't a relationship, it's definitely the time to approach another bank and ask for a second opinion. Okay. So the banks are in the business of giving loans. Bankers really are salespeople, right? Because the more loans they give, the more money the bank makes. If you feel from your banker that anything you ask for, the answer is a no, if you feel that it's difficult to get a loan, if you feel that it's difficult to get any accommodations, that's a big red flag. It's a big sign for you to go talk, explore other options, go talk to other bankers, right? How do we find these other bankers? Well, we all have contacts with other First Nations. We go to conferences. All these bankers go to conferences, right? If you go to AFOA conference or FMB, one of those, there's going to be First Nations bankers there. They even may have booths. They'll be on attendees. Definitely approach, present you like, sorry, this is my word. Approach them, get their business card and get in touch if your organization has the needs, right? And it's always, it seems that because really they're salesmen, it seems like you always get a better deal with a new bank as opposed to with an existing one, unless you have a very good relationship with the existing banker. I happen to have a good relationship with one of our bankers for one of my First Nations. So he's kind of more of, okay, how can this be done? If we need more financing or if we need a deferral on a loan, he does his best to help. So he feels like a valuable member of our team. And then I have another First Nation where the banker is a no person. It's always a no. Right? Can we get an increased line of credit? No. Can we get money for buying a business, a loan? No, right? There's always a no. And we're in the process of just talking to other banks because who wants a relationship with a nayssayer banker, right? You can always consider becoming an FNFA member for longer term projects. FNFA aren't there for your line of credit, for your operational financing, but for longer term projects, they're an option. How to apply for financing? Well, first of all, we want to determine our needs. Do we need an increase in line of credit? Do we need a loan for equipment or for housing? Do we need a loan for economic development? After we've determined our need, we want to review and understand the current financing structure, the current bank agreement, because many times we provided a blanket loan, almost like a line of credit for certain things like equipment purchases, right? So we review our bank agreement and we see, oh, I actually have a $200,000 equipment line that I can use for my need. Well, that's good to know. Or maybe I'm already using most of that equipment line and I want to approach my bank and say, okay, well, that's a 200,000, but I really need another 300. Can we increase it to 500,000, right? So understand your current bank agreement and how you'd like it changed, what needs to be added. If it is a brand new project, especially an economic development project or a construction project, you may need evaluation, business plan, and financial projections, right? And I should qualify myself here, for construction project, it's even more involved. You're gonna need some engineering drawings and construction schedule, so an engineer would need to be involved. But if we say we're just buying a building, like we're buying maybe a hotel or something like that, then we would need evaluation of the property. We would need a business plan and financial projections, like the even ISC would want that if we're applying for a grant, but for sure a bank would want that for financing. Now, for all these reports like valuation, business plan, financial projections, there is normally funding available. At least 80% of the cost can be covered through various government funding opportunities. Most recent audit and current internal financial statements will be required. The bank will want it. We want to approach the current bank and at least one more. Now we have excellent relationship with our current bank. Maybe first we give them a chance. If the relationship is so-so, then we want at least another bank working on it, because again, the other bank wants in, they may be offering a better deal. If it's a long-term project, we want to consider FNFA as an option. So bankers would normally lead the financing process. They'll give us a list of information that's needed, and then we can coordinate it. We don't have to provide it all ourselves. We may involve our lawyer if it's some legal documents. We may involve our financial advisors, maybe the auditors, if it's some projections or something that beyond our competence. So definitely involve a finance or accounting professional and a lawyer to make sure your interests are protected, right? Bank agreements and terms sometimes are tricky to read because they're legal language. Their lawyers create them, right? And to make sure our interest is protected, It's always good to get our lawyer to read through that agreement and tell us if they see any issues there. And it's also good to involve a finance or accounting professional, even our auditors, just to take a quick look and tell us what they think. Are there any mines? Are there any things that we don't see and we really should be aware of, written in small letters, especially for bigger loans? For bigger loans, we definitely want a finance committee or community approval or both, just because for First Nations, you know, they're run as communities, all the decisions are supposed to be made at the community level. And if we get into a big project, if we buy in a big investment, starting a big construction project, and it involves significant amount of debt, it's good to get that finance committee or community approval. We only want to borrow for solid projects that can repay the loans. Repayment amount should not cause cash flow issues. I've repeated that many times because I think it's so important. Understand loan security. So that collateral, the assets that I use to secure loans, very important. We should not use aggressive collateral. I'm going to give you an example. There is a First Nation that I know of that made investments in many different things. They took very aggressive loans, and a part of their security, loan security, is money sitting in the TLE trust, in the Treaty Land Entitlement Trust, right? So now, unfortunately, lots of these investments aren't good. Some of the money got put into housing without any plan for repayment, but those loans need to be repaid. So the bank, that it's actually like a private funder that gave them the loans, is now going after the money sitting in the TLE trust. And there is hundreds of millions of dollars in there. And that's unfortunate because that money in the TLE trust isn't supposed to just go for repaying bad loans, right? It's supposed to be supporting the community in the long run, in economic development and in operations and everything else. So very important to understand the collateral. This is why I really like to involve the lawyer and the accountant if the loan amounts are significant. How to review a bank agreement. So it's just like with everything. We know what we're looking for, and those things that we understand, that's what we're focusing on. The things that we don't understand could be not relevant to us, but to cover ourselves, we're going to ask our lawyer and maybe our accountant to review the agreement and tell us what they think. Okay, that's just for those things we don't understand. So what are the things that we should be focusing on? The ones that we understand? Well, loan amount and purpose, interest rate, repayment terms, loan security, any reports and requirements, any bank fees, right? Everything is common sense, and even if it's written in legal language, we can still understand it. Now, if there is certain language in there, certain provisions we don't understand, this is where we ask the banker to explain. Remember, they're salespeople. If they're offering us a loan, or if we have a loan with them, it's their job to make sure we're happy as a customer, to make sure we understand, right? So legal provisions, there is a long list of legal provisions in a bank agreement. Most of them are going to be standard. They're going to be standard for every bank. For new loans, I'm going to say it again, pay your lawyer whatever rate they have per hour, even if it is $500 per hour, it's worth the time. It's worth the effort for them to take a quick read and tell us if there is any significant things we need to be aware of. So there are normally two things. If a bank is offering us new loans, they're going to give us what's called a discussion paper. Okay, so now that discussion paper is going to be written in a more approachable language. So if you have a copy of the discussion paper, that's normally a better place to start. Okay, so in a discussion paper, they will summarize the loans they're offering. So you see here is overdraft lending, which is a line of credit there is a MasterCard, there is a demand loan. Now they like to use the word demand loan, right? Because that means they can demand at any time, which is not quite true because they have a term. But if you see that, don't get confused, it's just a term loan. Okay, so they're offering one term loan to term out completed capital projects and accounts payable. So this is accounts payable loan. Then there is another term loan to pay out the existing leases that have high interest rate. And then there is a master line for equipment, for future equipment purchases at $200,000. So acts just like a line of credit. I can access it when I buy equipment, and once it gets repaid, the room becomes available again. Okay, so then for every loan here, they're going to give us the basic information that we need. Okay, so we have for line of credit, the amount is 300,000. Loan type, well, they have some bank term here, which is not necessarily clear, but we know it's a line of credit. That's all we need to know. Purpose is working capital requirements, which basically is what line of credit is for, paying for expenses prior to receiving funding. Amortization, which is repayment, not applicable because there's no repayment, it revolves. Term renewed annually. So remember, that's the banking concept of a term, right? So they do an annual renewal, basically, which means they want our reporting requirements to make sure we still meet financially all the conditions for the loan. Interest rate, well, we talked about it. Variable rate, in this case, it's bank prime rate plus 2%. So at the time the First Nation borrowed this, which was July of 2020, the prime rate was 2.45%. So my total interest on line of credit was 4.45. Well, the prime rate right now is 6.7. So right now that interest rate is 8.7%, right? So quite an increase here. Repayment cash flow, meaning it revolves, and then they want a monthly fee of $200 for that line of credit, which is not uncommon. Okay, then we look at MasterCard is pretty straightforward, just like any credit card. Then let's look at term loans here. So the amount for the payables loan is 2.1 million. The purpose is to term out portion of accounts payable. Amortization is 20 years, right? So amortization is the loan duration, and now the term is up to 5 years. We can choose the term here based on what interest rate we go with. And here they give us an option here. Fixed rate, we have a 5-year term, and it is 3.39%. Okay, and here's my blended monthly payment, it's $12,000. I could also go with a variable rate, which is Bank of Canada prime rate plus 2%. So variable rate at the time we had this offer was 4.45%. Blended monthly payment was $13,000. So why would we go with a variable rate? Well, because variable rate loans normally allow early repayment. So if there was a concern with we don't want to be paying this loan for 20 years, right? Then we could go with variable rate, and then there's no penalty for repaying the loan anytime. Now, saying that, the loan still has a 5-year term. So once we finish the first 5 years, it'll reopen and we'll be able to decide then. So in this case, it was definitely smarter to take the fixed rate for 5 years and then make the decision for the future afterwards. Okay, so repayment, again, they're saying over maximum of 20 years, and on a monthly basis, there is a monthly repayment. And here they're telling us the prepayment. So if we want to repay the loan earlier, so prime-based loans, which is fixed rate, that's permitted at any time. And then fixed rate loans are permitted at maturity of terms, so only when the term ends, the 5 years, right? Okay, so we're gonna have similar terms here for the other loan, okay? And then equipment line of credit is gonna be pretty similar to regular line of credit, okay? The other things we want to pay attention to, they have conditions present to advances. So this is where they tell us what needs to happen before we get the loan. And some of them are pretty straightforward. There is the formal bank approval, there is compliance with all representation, there is providing all the information, but some of it is pretty specific. Like they want a confirmation from ISC that the First Nation is not in third party or management or co-management, right? They want a copy of year-to-date financial statements from the First Nation, copy of lease payouts, and updated accounts payable listing with confirmation that those accounts payable that we're trying to repay using the loan, like those are the amounts. There's no additional amount. So definitely pay attention to those more specific conditions. Financial covenants. So these are the what financial conditions do we have? So it says the borrower is not to obtain or secure outside financing without prior bank consent. So all banks are going to have something like this. So if I'm going with this bank, what they don't want me to do is to go elsewhere and get some private loans or some bank loans. And now the cash flow, instead of paying this bank's loans, may go to the other loans. So it jeopardizes their loan repayment. So if I want to refinance, well, I either fully refinance, or if I want to add a loan from somewhere else, I have to let the current bank know. Okay, and then in here, they also ask us to maintain the banking accounts, the daily banking accounts with them. And again, it's just to secure the loan repayment. It's pretty standard. So let's look at security. Okay, so they want the letter of agreement. They want us to sign the bank agreement. They want ISC revenue, and in this case, VLT gaming revenue, to go into a bank account at that bank, because this is what's used to repay some of the loans, and same with tobacco tax rebate. They want a bank council resolution to say we accept the terms of the agreement. That's good. And then the rest is just some documentation that they want. So the reason is really much security here, right? You can see that they're not even asking for specific security, right? So now reports and requirements. So they want an annual audit within 150 days after the year end. They want in-house financial statements with comparisons to budget, right? And that, does it say here when they want it? They want it annually, so that's prior to the audit. They want the annual budget, and then the year-end financial statements has to be an audit. So it's pretty straightforward. Now we get to the fees. So for fees, they want a one-time fee for accepting this offer of $15,000, which is a lot, but what are you gonna do? And then they want credit renewal fees annually of $2,500. You can try and negotiate with that. I've been successful sometimes not. Okay, so the rest here, we get into all sorts of legal provisions and whatnot, and this is just in general. This is when we can accept it, but it's still not a signature on the final bank agreement. So once we get a copy of the final bank agreement, and even with this letter, we do want our lawyer to review it, just to make sure that there is nothing in there that is, too aggressive or not fitting what we're trying to do. Okay, just for the sake of time here, I'm gonna say that when you have the actual bank agreement, it's gonna be more legal language, but they'll provide similar information, so definitely review it. Ask the banker questions if you don't understand it. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is there are unique financing opportunities for First Nations, right? So there is a First Nations Finance Authority. You can see here that while the Bank of Canada prime rate is 6.7, so all regular bank loans will be based on that, the long-term lending rate for FNFA is 4.25% right now, which is much lower. Loan terms can be 10, 20, or 30 years, and you can also get some interim financing, but it all is normally for long-term projects. There is the Community Economic Development Funds with loans, including forgivable portions for business projects. Interest rates are normally at the higher end, and repayment terms may be aggressive, but there is a forgivable portion. So it's definitely something to consider. Ontario Financing Authority Aboriginal Loan Guarantee Program. If you invest in some sort of an energy project, they would guarantee you loan. So that definitely makes it easier to get a loan from anywhere you go. Indigenous Economic Development Fund, Economic Development and Construction Project Grants and Loans. So this is one of the options to go to and ask for financing for your projects, and also for business plans and valuations. And then definitely CMHC for mortgages, because they have lower rates than most banks. Thank you for your time. I think I'm right on time here.